Hi, everybody.
Hello.
We are we are going to speak a little bit about our books, and we hope that we have some time to talk about what you want to talk about and to answer any questions if you have them. So thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming. It's a pleasure to talk to you, Stephanie, and to the audience.
Yeah. Well, we one of the questions that I was wondering about with your book, this is beautiful book, is where it comes from. How did you get the germ of the idea? When did you start working on it? Just your origin story.
Yeah, so when I first started working on it, I didn't realize that I was working on a novel. I had just started graduate school in creative writing, and I had always loved the documentary Paris is Burning, which is kind of the maybe source text, if you would, for the book. And so the novel is about, well, the novel contains characters that are based on people who actually lived in the 80s and 90s, and then some of the characters are fictionalized. So it's about a group of gay and trans Latinx kids in New York City in the 1980s who run away from home, abusive families, and they form their own proxy family called the House of Extravaganza, which is still a house that exists today in the voguing scene in New York City. And so when I was watching the documentary as a teenager, I had watched it so many times. I come back to it every 6 months. And I just started writing about it. I didn't realize that I wanted to write a novel about it, but then I had 45 pages, and the scope was so large that it felt like a project I wanted to stay with for a few years.
Is that when you started thinking about the telling it in different voices with the kind of the multivocal way of telling story?
The first draft is a little different than the draft that appears in the book now, the final draft. I originally intended for it to be a first-person omniscient, and he's telling the story of the people that he knew in the past, but then the structure changed as the novel kind of grew, and yeah.
Which character did you start with?
With Daniel.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
And your novel is inspired by The Great Gatsby, but takes place in contemporary North Carolina. So when I was reading it and the past few days as I was preparing to come here and talk with you, I was wondering like what your relationship was like to that novel when you first read it and when you also first started to think about this.
I have a similar kind of origin story. I think it's one of those things that just gets stuck in the back of your head and you can't really get it out. And there were so many unanswered questions in Gatsby, like who are these people who don't get to speak much? And even the people who don't speak at all. Like, there's one scene very early on in the book, and some servants come in and take care of the Buchanan family, and the Buchanan are Tom and Daisy. And I was thinking, what are they thinking about this scene? About these people who seem to have no jobs and who seem to be very unhappy, and what are they thinking? Or the people who are riding by in the car. There's one moment in Gatsby when they're all going into the city to this horrible party that happens, and there's a car, a yellow Cadillac or some big car, and there are black people in the car who apparently own it, and the Gatsby and the other characters are really surprised by the affluence of the black people. And so I just thought about who are those people who pass by? What did they think about our characters? And so from those kind of fringes, I thought about reinterpreting the story.
And did you start with the character of Jay or JJ and the house that is built?
No, I didn't at all.
Okay.
Yeah, I started with Sylvia. Sylvia is the main character. She's about 70, and I actually started with an image. She was going to. She was pregnant. She was an older pregnant woman for the time, and she was going to the OBGYN, which was a black doctor, meaning that these are white men who were the doctors for the black women in the town. And so people referred to them as the black doctors. And so she had to go to him for all of those kinds of services. And I based this on experiences that happened to people in my hometown, which is Lenore, North Carolina. And these were the only places to go if you were pregnant, and it was very hard to be there, and it was very hard to accept these kinds of services because they were often ill-treated. And so that's where it started. What do you do for love, right? What do you know you love your baby, you know you want your baby to be safe, so you have to go and kind of endure some indignity for that to happen. And so then the story started rolling from there.
Yeah, one of the things that I really love about Sylvia's character is that she also plays a foil to her daughter Ava, who's trying to get pregnant and has to go through possibly IVF, and she is the only first person sections in the novel are her talking to chat rooms with other women who are experiencing a similar struggle, and I really liked reading those parts.
Oh, thank you. You know, if we'd had more time, I'd love for you to read some of the letters. It reminded me a lot of the kind of the thing that I was trying to do with the chat rooms. You know, these personal letters that your characters, these longing, just boys really, who have these desires for great things in life and have no idea how to get to them, and they write letters. And would you talk about that just a little bit?
Letters in my book?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, so Hector, he was one of the characters that was based on a person who actually lived, and he was the proxy father of the House of Extravaganza, and he died of AIDS complications in the mid-'80s, and so he never really got to see what the house would later become. And so in the novel, I have 2 letters that he writes, and after he's diagnosed, a therapist in the novel tells him to just kind of express himself and write these letters, and he wants to be a professional dancer, and so one letter is written to Alvin Ailey, and I think it's actually excerpted in the booklet that you received, and then the second letter was written to Martha Graham. And one of the aspects of research that, like a roadblock that I hit, was that there isn't a lot of information that's available about people who are not incredibly famous, right? Like if you want to write a novel about Abraham Lincoln, there's a lot of information that you can go to, but if you want to write a novel about Hector Extravaganza, there wasn't as much. But one thing that stuck out to me was people would describe him as a beautiful dancer. And so as I imagined him fictionalized in the book, I gave him this dream of wanting to be a dancer, and so he would write these letters. I wanted to place his life into conversation with kind of a larger history of art or contemporary dance, and so I had him write and kind of express himself in a way that felt more intimate than a third-person narrator.
Yeah, and you know, because of the form of the letter, you get to really feel what the person feels. I mean, the intimacy is the word for that.
Yeah, I guess it's like maybe second person too. So the reader is reading it, and it almost feels as if the character is speaking directly to them.
And I love a letter too because there's something about it. You know that it's personal and private, but you also expect that it will be read at some point. I mean, it's almost like if you're writing in a diary, you know it's for you and maybe for a future you, and so there's another implied audience. You know, when you have a letter, it too, like a diary entry. That's really kind of an exciting form.
Yeah, and I don't think I had intended for the letters to make their way into the final version of the book. I thought when I was first writing them that they were just going to be an exercise in voice for me to understand his character, and then there was something that sizzled on the page, and it felt urgent and necessary to include it in the final draft of the book.
Oh wow, yeah, that's great.
Yeah, did you feel that way with Ava's chat room sections, or?
I had a hard time with that. I was writing a story about this character, Ava, and she's having a very hard time getting pregnant, and nothing's working, and she's spending money she doesn't have, trying to figure out the thing that will work. And she finds a community online, and if anything that you're going through, but this in particular, you can find communities of people who who've miscarried, people who have been trying for many years, people who have given up and have figured out or moved to another place with it. I mean, you can find all of those communities, which is a wonderful thing, and especially if you don't feel like there's anyone in your life that you can speak to intimately about it. She can't speak to her mother because her mother, she doesn't want to make her mother even any sadder than she is. And so she's not the person. And she doesn't have really close friends. And that's one of the things that I've wanted to explore in this book is the idea of loneliness in adulthood, and that it's a real thing, and that there are a lot of people who don't have people to connect to and people to really talk to about the things that are most important, or sometimes about much of anything. And I don't know, have you heard about the Minister of Loneliness in Great Britain?
No.
Isn't that cool? I just love it. It sounds like a band or something,
Yes.
but it's an actual position because they feel like that loneliness has become an epidemic. And I really think that that's true here
gosh.
too.
Yeah, so what types of things do they do?
I don't know. I love that job though. It's like, are you lonely? Okay,
I mean,
come with me.
I'm just imagining the office for the Minister of Loneliness, and I hope it's not just one desk inside.
I know. That would be sad. Yeah. So titles. I get asked about title a lot. I'm really interested in your title. Do you get asked about it a lot, and where did it come from?
I do get asked about it a lot.
Yeah.
I knew early on what I wanted the title to be, but I don't exactly remember how it came to me. I knew, I was thinking, like, what should the title of this book be? And I knew it was about a house, and that the idea of a house was really important. And then I think as I was doing research, I read the phrase impossible beauties and what that meant. And so the House of Impossible Beauties just felt like it had a ring to it. Mm-hmm. And then, it almost feels like as soon as you hear that title, as soon as I heard that title, I knew, okay, this is the title for the book. It felt right. Yeah. Yeah, what about your title?
Yeah, I really love it, and the idea of house and home, and the epigraph of James Baldwin really fits.
That home is simply an irrevocable condition.
Yes, I love that. I love that. And my title, when this is the paperback cover, but the hardback cover was a house. And I wanted it to be about, how do you make a home for yourself, and what's important, and how you get out of that house if you need to, that kind of thing. But the title came to me one day, and I was thinking about when you are at the lowest point in your life, when you're feeling like there's nothing else. And when you realize that no one is coming, that can be both a terrifying moment, and it can also be a galvanizing moment. The moment when you realize, okay, this is it, and I don't have what I need in some important ways, and I don't have the support I need in some really important ways, and I have to figure it out. And so I wanted it to have both of those elements. What I didn't want it to have was like zombie apocalypse elements. I was really afraid, like, no one is coming to save you, and my editor, which is your editor, said, okay, we will not put like fire on the cover, or anything like that, so people won't be afraid of what's to come.
No zombies, no fire.
No zombies, no fire.
Well, the cover is really beautiful. Both covers were beautiful, the hardcover and the cover.
Oh, thank you. And this cover was Amy Sherrill did it, who is Michelle Obama's portrait artist. And when we first got it, my editor said, "Oh my God, it looks like Michelle Obama," and it does. It's got the blue and the white dress, and so I really love it.
I'm curious to know more about what you think of homage, and what parts of your novel have more of a direct link to Gatsby and the plot of Gatsby, and where you kind of diverged.
I have a few things that I feel like we're playing on Gatsby. You know, a few moments that feel like Gatsby. But for the most part, it's not a retelling of that story. And you know, and it's very nerve-wracking to talk about my book and Gatsby in the same breath. You know, it's one of the most loved books in American literature. You know, and so I don't want to say, okay, this book is in any way, this book pales in comparison, so I don't want them to be compared. I want the idea of Gatsby, the longing, the desperation, the trying to figure out where your home is, that kind of thing, but not as a retelling. And you know, with your book, you're dealing with some actual real people in the world. So how did you maneuver that?
Yeah, so as I was watching the documentary over and over again, there would be times where I would see an image or hear a line of dialogue that I would incorporate into the book. But for the most part, they almost feel like completely separate projects, or that they have different MOs, right? So the documentary feels voyeuristic in a way because of the camera lens. You are watching the ball unfold. You're watching people who are talking to the camera. Whereas with a novel, we're more concerned with consciousness and exploring the inner lives of characters. And so what I wanted to do was maybe distill the souls of each of the people and then really figure out how to explore their domestic life. Like, what was it like when the cameras were shut off for the documentary and they had to go back home and figure out like what they were going to eat for dinner and how they were going to navigate their interpersonal relationships, especially in a time when the AIDS crisis was looming in the background and they didn't necessarily have the types of support systems that exist today that help LGBT homeless youth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And in both of our books, we have to deal with the idea that people kind of know what's going to happen, right? Mm-hmm. So there is not that you aren't holding a reader or an audience in suspense in some important ways because the plot has been determined. How did you negotiate that?
Yeah, so I thought, well, if this is a novel about LGBT people in the 80s, and you kind of know how it's going to end. If you are familiar with some of the people from the documentary, you may know how they die, and so that element is not going to be surprising, but maybe the path that leads you there will be surprising.
Yes.
And then when they come to their end, then it might be. The goal isn't necessarily to surprise, but to make the reader feel emotion. Mm-hmm. So I wanted people to read and experience what like joy and laughter and love was for these characters, so that way when they eventually meet their end, you will feel the impact of that loss. Mm-hmm. Because it's I wanted this to be an homage not just to the documentary, but to an entire generation of people who are just lost.
Yeah. Yes, I think that's absolutely right. And even when there's, like in my book, I don't think that anyone has any illusions that it's they're all going to live happily ever after. No, it's just, and especially with a Gatsby kind of overlay, that's not going to be.
Yeah, so I was sitting in the balcony for the presentation earlier, and when he said that Americans like tragedies with happy endings. Mm-hmm. And I remember when we sent out the novel to editors, I had a conversation with one editor on the phone that said, I really like everything in the novel, except I want to talk about the ending. And I said, oh, okay. And she's like, I just think it needs just a little more of an uplifting ending, a happier ending. Thought like, oh, like how would I do that? And I didn't want to be the writer that was like, no, I'm completely wed to all of my ideas and I'm not going to listen to any changes. So I listened. I wanted to listen and see if that editor was saying something that I just couldn't see. Mm-hmm. But then when I thought about it, I slept on it and I thought, but wouldn't it feel just emotionally untrue or false to provide a happy ending just to make people feel better about it? Yeah. And I just worry that sometimes nostalgia can provide a different, kind of rose-tinted lens when we look at some sad things that have happened in our past.
Yeah, I think that's right too. And I think that as reading as adults and that we understand that the story is continuing, and that I feel like that we all understand that there are proud and happy and wondrous moments in almost every life, but there are also some deeply sad ones. And so depending on where the story ends is where you rest on that
Yeah.
on that issue, And so I feel like to say, I mean, what you're trying to say in the novel is really punctuated by the ending. So I think you were right.
I think one thing that our books have in common is, for the most part, it's a really sad story when you look at it on the whole. But there are moments where there is humor in it, and I keep coming back to the chat room scenes because I really like them. But there are other people who respond, who are not really characters. They just are a username, and they're responding to Ava's and giving her support. But then there's one person who's kind of saying things that maybe you shouldn't say when you're trying to console someone, and then people respond like, "Don't say that. This is a supportive community." Blah blah. And then they have names like who's like someone's mommy, And so like finding, trying to represent how we actually speak to each other, and maybe representing the sadness of maybe and the loneliness of a chat room community, but also the odd quirks of it that make it just a little funny sometimes. Like, there are so many things that I see when I walk down the street when I think, wow, would you look at that? Like a really small detail that just is like a little funny, even if I'm having a bad day. And so I think novels can be like that too, where we can tell sad stories, but there can be scenes that are funny. Right? Like I have a scene in my book where characters just go and order cheesecake, and they flirt with the straight waiter and make him blush, and it's the game that they play who can make him blush the first. And it's just completely whimsical because that's how life is. We toggle back and forth between our various emotions, and yeah. So I think that's something that we have in common in our books, like that I liked when there were humorous times too.
Right, and I think we have to, and I think that having both of those ideas, holding both of those ideas at the same time, brings a kind of specificity to the work that makes it feel real. Yeah. And with just dire situation after dire situation, there would be not only would it be a downer, but it would be false, because that's not the way we live most of us.
And it runs the risk of feeling static for the reader if you provide them with the same emotion. One thing that I like to do sometimes is start a scene, and it's a funny scene, but then it ends on a tragic note, and I think humor can be disarming for the reader, because they don't necessarily see something that is going to come that might shock them.
Yeah, I do too.
Yeah.
Should we take a few questions?
Yeah, how are we doing with time and questions?
Love to, if you have questions about the books or about the process.
Yeah, if there's anything more that we can say about something that we already talked about. I want to talk about the wall art scene too, and Marcus. Are you trying to? Okay, yeah, we can get back on that. Okay, so one question that I always like to ask other writers, specifically novelists, because novels are longer projects, what surprised you the most during the process of writing the book?
I had a number of surprises, and one of the biggest ones is I finished a draft of the novel. It took me about 2 years, and I thought it was done, and I thought it was okay. And it surprised me to the core that I was thinking about the novel at the wrong time in the characters' lives. And so the first draft of the novel, everyone is much younger. It's, they're, Ava, who is now about 40, was then about 20. So the next draft I set about 20 years later. And it's in the aftermath of a terrible grief in the family. And I had no idea. That was not a good surprise. I had no idea that was going to happen. What about you?
I was surprised how maybe after the halfway point, when you've accumulated a lot of pages, but you don't necessarily know what order they're going to be in or if they're going to remain in the final draft, how it consumed so much of my mind. Like even when I was walking down the street or shopping for groceries, that I could hear something or see someone and be like, oh, that smile is the smile that would belong on my character. Or that line of dialogue is something that I'm going to incorporate in the book. And then as I was approaching the end of the book, I remembered it. I didn't know how I wanted the book to end. I had outlined a lot of the book when I was in the middle, but I didn't know how I wanted it to end. And I recalled a conversation that I had had earlier, maybe like 4 or 5 years earlier. I was on a date with a guy who had just started medical school, and they have them attend a lecture, basically, to teach them empathy, to teach them bedside manner. And they brought in someone who had been diagnosed with AIDS during the 80s, but did not die. And he told them that no one, during the early years, no one knew how it was spread, and there was a lot of fear, and no one wanted to touch him, right? So he had not felt any contact on his skin for a while, and that caused him to feel despair. And so he would go onto the subways during rush hour in New York City, just so that he could be like crammed in the middle, just so he could feel like the warmth of human bodies around him. And that, I remember being stunned when I heard this story over dinner, but I didn't necessarily forget about it, but I didn't ever think I would incorporate it into the book until I was approaching the end. And so what surprised me, this goes back to what surprised me, is that my relationship with my own memories and things that I don't necessarily think about on a day-to-day basis, I was surprised to see how they resurfaced in my mind as I was trying to work out different technical problems in the book. And that was just stunning and emotional. Yeah.
It really is. It's a very emotional process. You don't think of it that way, and because you're kind of pulling yourself inside out to try to figure out another person, and how you can put that person on the page. And I teach, as you do, I teach undergraduates, and one of the things that I've found is like the first about 70 pages, you've got just the excitement and the energy of it, you've got the great idea-ness of it, and those come fairly quickly. But after that, it's really a struggle trying to figure out, okay, I've got these wonderful characters in this wonderful situation, now what do I do with it, And there are a lot of people with about 60, 75 pages of a novel in a drawer somewhere, because that initial energy is great and it gets you, gets the, butts and seats and gets you at the computer. But the idea, the underpinning of the story is what will sustain it, and that's the part that you're talking about, that kind of emotional upheaval that happens.
Yeah, it's almost like we're creating a network of different symbols and characters, and as the further we get into it, the more locked in we are, and then we have to figure out how exactly we're going to tie things together in a way that makes sense, which is hard. When you're in the middle of it, you don't see the end. I had a teacher in grad school who described it as you are on, actually Key West would be a great place to kind of tell this anecdote. You're on the beach, the southernmost point, and you start swimming towards Cuba. Eventually you're going to hit a point where you no longer see the land behind you, and you don't see Cuba yet, but you know that if you keep swimming, you'll eventually see land. So that's like when you're like 200 pages in, you have no idea what's happening. And then you keep going and you just hope you don't drown. And then you see that little glimmer of land and you see the end in sight. You know that you could get there.
Right.
And that's, I think the final stretch is the most fun part of writing. The beginning and then like the final stretch when you know that, oh, I can actually complete this project.
Yeah, I think so too. That reminds me of something Ernest Gaines told me one time, that, and he maps things out. He knows where it's going to start, and he knows where it's going to end, and he likened it to being on a train. you don't know who's going to get on. You don't know when you make the stops, and you don't know what's going to happen when they get on or who you're going to meet. But he knows where he's going. And I've tried to think about that, especially with my short stories, trying to think about maybe I'm leaving myself open for surprise during the middle, but I should have some idea of where it's taking me, And writing and stories are emotional experiences, and so you want the reader to feel that emotional experience, and so maybe knowing what that is can, help me get there a little bit
Yeah, it almost
easier.
feels like a road trip, and then you see that sign, you're kind of getting hungry, and you see that
Yes.
sign that's like, world's biggest beach chair.
That's
And you're
right.
like, oh yeah, like I really love beach chairs. I want to go see that beach
That's
chair.
right.
And then, you take a detour, right?
That's it.
Like there might be something that you're writing, you're like, oh, I didn't plan for this scene, but maybe I want to explore that and see where it goes. And it just makes the route longer, but you do know where your final destination is.
That's right. That's right. And sometimes you go to see the beach is a total bust.
Yeah.
And you think, why did I do that? But there is a reason for doing it.
Yeah.
It taught you something about that angle or that character or that moment. And I try to remember that I am learning something even when I'm looping around.
Definitely. Or it's almost as if there is something in the back of our mind that's telling us, like hinting that if it seems really interesting, that we should explore it, and maybe it's, not at the forefront of our thinking, right? Like it's in our, subconscious, and that little hint of like, yeah, just go and write about it and see what it is the subconscious telling us that it's worth it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to talk about the Walmart scene. Because, you mentioned that we were both teaching, and one thing that I notice a lot in undergraduate stories is that characters don't really confront other characters. And the Walmart scene was an example where Ava's shopping at Walmart, and she sees a character that she kind of wants to confront, and then she walks out. She goes as if she's going to the exit, and then she's like, no, I'm gonna go talk to her. And then she goes and talks to her, and I just want to know, what was it like when you were writing that scene? Did you know that it was going to be a confrontation scene? Did that surprise you? Did you know that the other character was going to be there? Like, I just want to know more about that.
There's the scene is when one of the characters meets the woman that her husband has been involved with for some time, and she knows about it. She knows about it in a place that's kind of deeper than her own kind of surface knowledge. She knows it, but she doesn't want to face it, because if she faces it, that means that she has to do something about it. And she's been trying to have a baby, and she's been trying to have a life. And she feels like that this knowledge will get in the way of those things. I mean, it's a crazy way of thinking, but it's the sorts of accommodations that we sometimes do to make our lives run smoother. And so she meets her, and if you've ever had one of those moments, or you feel like most of my days I would say nothing, but today is not going to be one of those days,
Yeah.
And so, I wanted her to be in keeping with her character. She is not a mean person, and she's not a person who would necessarily, just blow up or be that person. And she's also is expected to. She feels like there are eyes on her all the time, that she has to be a certain kind of person in the world. And so she reacts in a way that I'm hoping is in keeping with who she is. But I really needed her to have that moment. And I thought from the time that I thought about the story, I thought that they would meet, that there would be some kind of meeting between the two women who love in a certain way one very flawed man, and who also loves both of them in certain ways, but he has personal weaknesses that keep him from loving anybody too much.
Yeah. What I love about the dialogue in their confrontation is that it's not really just a fight. They're not saying mean things to each other. but it's so loaded because we know what both of these we know what one character knows and what the other suspects, and I was kind of wondering, how is this fight going to unfold? I specifically remember this scene because I had to go to a lunch meeting, and I was reading before the lunch meeting, and I was like, oh, she's walking out of the Walmart, I guess I'll go to the lunch. But I was like, oh, I'll read one more page. And I thought, oh, she's gonna get into a fight, I can't leave yet. You know, when you're reading, you're like, oh, I guess I'll just be like 10 minutes late, I have to finish this chapter. It was one of those moments for me. I loved it.
Thank you. You know, I was talking to you a little bit earlier about some of the scenes, and there was a scene, it's later on in the book when Daniel is working in a furniture store, and a woman comes in and is too familiar with him, and seems that she knows too much about him, and she invades his space. And one of the things that he says is, "How does she know who I am? How does she know that?" I mean, I love that, and it's that same kind of thing. And that we're talking about, this confrontation and this moment when he says, "I'm going to fix her," but he doesn't. He pulls back.
Yeah, it's a loaded moment because he's working at this upscale furniture store, and he is in love with this white couch. He really wants this designer couch, but he cannot afford it. And so he's saving up for it, and she comes in and she wants the couch, but she can very easily afford it. And she kind of insults it, and she says, like, I don't know, maybe the couch is too faggy, you know. And which I got that line from something that someone said to me. I worked at a children's shoe store, and a woman came in. She was looking for nice black shoes for her son's communion, and she just looked at them and was like, I don't know if my husband's gonna like them. Like, do they look a little faggy? And it was a moment where I was like, oh, she said this because she doesn't realize that I'm gay, which is not an experience that I have very often, but I thought, like, yeah, so how do I negotiate this, you know? And I think, you know, I just looked at her with, like, you know, eyes, and she, you know, apologized, as the woman does in the scene. She says, you know, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be gauche, like, I have, you know, a lot of gay friends, essentially. And yeah, so that was kind of a scene that I took from just that one line of dialogue, was from life.
Yeah, but the scene is so full and so rich because you know that feeling when someone has just invaded your space, and it's a kind of breathlessness, but it's also just sheer rage, and you're trying to figure out what to do with it, and your whole life passes before your eyes. You know, will I keep my job? Will, you know, what will happen in this moment?
Yeah.
And that's really wonderfully done because of the terror and the pathos, and you know, I've really enjoyed that moment.
Yeah, that's sofa. Yeah.
I have been in love with sofas too, so I totally get that.
How are we doing with time? Because I
think we're getting the
okay. Do you want to get some questions if anyone has a hot question?
Sure.
Hi, thanks so much. I enjoy your books both immensely. I have a quick question, or not, depending on how you answer, for both of you. I'm really interested in the relationship between Sylvia and Marcus in your book, Stephanie, and found it really interesting in the beginning and confusing, and then I became more attached to it. And I was just wondering how you came up with that. Joseph, you said that it was the research, the challenge of doing research for people who aren't famous. How did you do that? And especially, were you able to meet people who were in the original documentary? Is the ball scene still active? Like, did you go meet people who are in it now? Or, you know, I'm fascinated by it too. I love the documentary and sort of what that looked like. Thanks.
Do you want to go first?
Sylvia meets a man named Marcus who is in prison, and he calls her, and she just starts talking with him. And this came to me because when I lived in Missouri, when I was in graduate school, someone called our house, and who was from a state prison, and they ask you to accept charges, and then he asked if we would send a message to his loved ones and to get in touch with him. And which we called and left a message on a machine, but it was just such a surreal moment. One, I'm not sure how desperate you'd have to be to call somebody just out of the blue, just randomly call somebody's number and hope that they would pick up and hope that they would accept these very expensive charges and hope that they would then call someone else that you felt like might care about you in the world. And so that has always stuck with me, this whole idea that the people reaching out from a different place, almost from another world, and saying, can you help me? And so I thought about Sylvia, and as we were talking about before, about being lonely and loneliness, and how do you make a friend in the world if there are certain doors that are shut to you? And so I thought that this was an interesting way to get them together. And he's a young man. Her son, her deceased son, was older than, was a little bit younger than he is, but they were around the same age. And she's developed a relationship with him that is strange and that confuses people, but gives her comfort. Thank you.
In terms of research, most of the people from the documentary are no longer alive. So I wasn't able to talk to any of the original people that were in Livingston's documentary. But I relied a lot on primary source, or I don't know if that would be the word, but first-person accounts of memories that people had. So for example, there's one scene early on in the book where two characters go to a club called Paradise Garage, which was just a 2-story parking garage in downtown Manhattan. And it is no longer open, but there are people who speak about their memories of that place. And so I would read those accounts. I read the account by, I think, 3 people, and they would describe how the DJ, Larry, he would kind of test out his new mixes, and he would play them over and over and over again, and then people would say, okay, we get it, we're done with this song. So it almost became a conversation back and forth between the audience and the DJ. They described the energy of the place, the way that the cement blocks reverberated, and they also talked about how there was no bar there. There were just tables with punch bowls, which I would not have known, right? If I had not read that, I may have had the characters go up and buy a rum and Coke. But I incorporated that into the book. So whenever I was reading accounts of memories of New York at that time, during the 80s and early 90s, I would try and find the small details that would help make the larger picture of the scene feel true. Right, so one of the characters later in the book has a matchbook from Boy Bar with 2 little bees and a circle. So I described that in the book. I looked at a lot of photographs of Venus Extravaganza in particular, who's one of the characters. I wanted to know what she was wearing, what her hair looked like. There were photos of her on the subway. What did the subway look like? The graffiti, it looks very different than the subway does today, right? There's a lot of graffiti. There were ads for Newport cigarettes, the Aqueduct racetrack. So I wanted to capture what New York felt like at that time. And then I befriended someone who was doing an MFA in dance in Iowa City, and he had trained in the Martha Graham method, and he was on Broadway. He was in Cats on Broadway. So I was asking him about dance. I sat him down for lunch, and I just said, talk to me as if I were a dancer. Just use your jargon. Tell me more about Martha Graham so I can incorporate that language into the book so that Hector could speak that way and use those phrases. And he told me that he knew someone who knew Jose Extravaganza, who is, I think, the current father or grandfather of the house. And so I managed to get his email, and I emailed him, and he never responded. And I don't blame him. I was, I think at the time, a 25 or 26-year-old graduate student who had never published anything and who could not pay him any money, to talk. So, I tried a second time, but I didn't get anything. So I understand why I wasn't able to talk to them. But I tried to find what I could in the archives that are available.
We have time for just one more.
I like the question about surprises. And I had the sense that the surprises really came from within you. And I'm wondering if you had any fresh eyes, beta readers, copy editors, who surprised you with material that you didn't realize needed to be in the book.
Sure. Do you want to go?
I did. One of the things that that I was surprised about was JJ. He is the Gatsby-like character, and the editor asked me for a little bit more about him. That she wanted to know more about this character, and I wanted him to be a little bit shrouded in a little bit of mystery. I wanted him to not be known that much, and there's some things that I wanted about his past to be revealed, about his family in particular, and about how he spent the last few years when he was apart from the other main characters. But I wanted a little bit of that mystery, but I did tweak it a little bit more, and I think it made it better.
I was working on the book when I was in graduate school, so as I was writing, I was submitting chapters to a class of people, and they would give me comments. But then once I finished the draft and I was done with grad school, I had a couple of kind of beta test readers, my editor, the assistant editor. It went through 2 rounds of copy editing, and I think with different copy editors. I'm sorry? Yeah, I went through 2 rounds of copy editing and then 2 of proofreading, but the 2 things that I thought were really kind of mind-blowing about the first round of copy editing was how copy editors save lives, by the way. There was one detail where it's a very small moment in the book where a character he's holding the subway coin in his hand, and he presses it really hard, and then he looks at his finger and he sees the indent, and he sees his body like, it's returning to normal slowly, and he's just marveling at the way that human bodies work. Because I thought that at that year, I don't know if it was like 1992, that the coins had holes, like donuts. Well, the copy editor went and found pictures of every single subway token since, since the early 20th century, whenever the subway, and found that actually the coin had an indent, but it wasn't a perfect hole like a donut, and asked if I wanted to change the way the sentence was written. And I don't think I needed to change the sentence in that moment because it would still cause kind of the indent that was referred to, but I thought that is such a small detail that I would have never thought about, right? That, and also the scene that I mentioned earlier where 2 characters are eating cheesecake. I have them eating cheesecake at Junior's in Midtown Manhattan, and there's also a location in Brooklyn. Well, the Brooklyn location is the original one, and the one in Midtown wasn't opened the year that the scene takes place. So she wanted to know if I wanted to change the detail back to Brooklyn, but then the next scene takes place at Saks Fifth Avenue, and they walk there. So I couldn't. But then she said, oh, it's fine. There was a place called Lindy's. Just have them go to Lindy's. And I was like, oh my God, you're amazing. Thank you.
Oh, here's Tim. Thank you so much.
Thanks.